The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
So good morning, good afternoon to those of you who have already dialed into the webinar. I appreciate you coming today. We're glad you're here. It's a couple of minutes until 12. So if you'll just hang out here with us for a moment, we'll get started soon. Oh, Marsha, I forgot to ask you, as people come along with questions during the session, do you want me to hold those questions to the end, or do you want me to try to find a natural break, or did you build in breaks for questions?
I will pause every once in a while so that you can ask questions. I'm a fan of questions along the way.
Awesome, got it. Okay, thank you. Okay, let's go ahead and get started, everybody. Welcome to the October edition of the PASS Women in Technology virtual group webinar. We are very glad that you could join us. If you're here, hopefully you're a member of the PASS Women in Technology group. And if not, why not? But also, if you learned about this one, I would hope that you're aware of other virtual groups that are out there that meet again monthly, just like this, for you to get a day of free training, sitting at your desk on a host of different topics, from Power BI to optimization to PowerShell and general DBA tools. Let's see if I can. There we go. So we have two sponsors, as always, an embarrassment of riches, as I like to say. Century One has been our sponsor for a very, very long time. We have a great relationship with them. And Redgate came aboard this year, and it's been a really successful relationship with them. They will be responsible for whoever wins the Amazon gift card at the end of the session. All of our sessions, including this one, are recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel. Please don't try to memorize or jot down that path, but feel free to just search for PASS WIT on YouTube. You'll find us there, and you'll find this session hopefully by this afternoon. And all of our past sessions for at least the last 2.5 years are up there as well. So I mentioned joining the virtual chapter. I promise we don't harass you. You get one email a month. And you get our monthly newsletter where we talk about women in tech, we talk about some issues with women in tech, and we highlight what women are doing with PASS and the data platform. You can always follow us on Twitter at @PASS_WIT and follow the hashtag PassWit. Use the hashtag PassWit. If there's something that you want to draw to our attention, if you know of a female speaker or a female who's doing something amazing in tech, use that hashtag and we will happily help amplify that. If you are not already registered for the PASS Summit, that is in less than a month, frighteningly enough, you can always still get registered and use our discount code. This will save you $150 off your attendance fee. We have we have a bunch of SQL Saturdays the rest of this month. And I don't think I managed to capture all of them here. But SQL Saturday Holland, El Salvador, Columbus, and that is Georgia, not Ohio. Columbus, Ohio has theirs typically over the summer in July. Charlotte, North Carolina, Madrid, Munich, and Lincoln, Nebraska are coming up. Upcoming sessions for the Women in Tech user group using Azure Databricks, a scalable data solution. Ginger Grant is going to be presenting. I realized today that date is incorrect. I realize that says 2/18, but it's actually incorrect on the website. It's either supposed to be the Wednesday after Thanksgiving, which will be the 28th, or the 14th, and I think I just messed up when I did it. So I'll correct that, and we'll make sure that goes out correctly in the newsletter. Today's session is Marsha Pierce with Pure Storage. I love her. She's awesome. She's out of Nashville. She's going to be speaking today on SQL Server with Docker containers, kind of an overview of creating SQL Server containers, and a lot of the how-to questions that you're going to want answered as we move along. So Marsha, if you're ready, I can go ahead and turn this over to you, or if you need me to song and dance for a little bit while you work on your demo, I can.
No, I think I have it running, so
Okay.
you can go ahead and pass it over.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to share my screen. Show screen. If I can figure out how to share my screen,
It
then
should
we'll be
pop
good.
up.
Oh no! Oh, there it is. It's popping over on the other screen. I kept hitting the button. Hold on. Show my screen.
There we go.
All right. So I'm going to start off. We're going to start off a little bit of this first, and then we're going to.
Let me interject. So if we had some people join late, if you have a question to ask Marsha along the way, feel free to type it into. There's a question option in your webinar. And Marsha has built in some natural pauses so that we can ask them as we go, because she really, really wants to make sure you understand every concept that she's talking about before we move on to the next. So questions are not only welcome, but are encouraged. So now back to you, Marsha.
All right, absolutely. Yeah, I do love questions. So we're going to talk about SQL Server containers, the evolution of the deployment speed. So a little bit, just so you know, I think Reed told you a little bit about me. I live in Nashville, Tennessee. I've been an architect for a really, really long time. My picture doesn't quite look like that anymore. I have white streaks down my hair. Before joining Pure Storage, I worked at Asurion here in Nashville, and prior to that, HCA, but I worked at lots of different companies. SQL Server is definitely my specialty and where my heart is, but I've worked with lots of different databases. And I do work for a storage company, and that's probably because I have driven every storage admin and VM admin crazy that I have worked with. That's not true. Some of them I was very close with. But if you have any questions, you can tweet at me at Marsha Pierce DBA, and I should update this. You can also email me, marsha@purestorage.com. I got a new email address, but the old one still works too. So this is my little fun slide. So when we look at like how we've been deploying containers for a long time, if you think about back into the legacy days, we would do data center deployments. It was usually kind of this waterfall project, and we would do these huge implementations of hardware, implementing the software in this big waterfall movement, and it would take usually for like a large financial application or something like that, maybe 2 or 3 years to kind of get that deployed and start rolling out in your environment. Then in around 2008, 2005, maybe we started looking at virtualization. That came out, and VMs kind of took off and running. Those kind of lived around for a long time, for years as well, but you could deploy them a lot quicker. So if you started the automating, you could get them deployed maybe in a couple of hours. You know, initially it might take you a couple days to get them built rather than weeks. And then you could deploy them with the automation using something like the Realized Orchestrator or Cisco's cloud tools, that you can build your on-prem cloud solution. You can start spinning those up and down. Containers are really nice because they deploy really, really quickly in just a few minutes. And then in the future, what is coming is microservices, but today we're going to kind of talk about containers. So, and we kind of talked a little bit about this, or I mentioned it. Why would you want to go with containers? Because they're going to be deployed really easily. In just a few seconds, you'll see how quickly we can start and stop a container. If you've ever had to modify an automation template, you know that there's a lot of moving pieces and parts because you've got all the infrastructure pieces to coordinate with. And so sometimes modifying a template for a virtual machine or a physical machine can be very time consuming and is not very quick and very simple to automate. And so we'll look at kind of some of the orchestration tools that help you automate the containers. So what are containers? So usually when we talk about SQL Server, we're talking about an application-based container. That container just virtualizes the single application and doesn't have any of the underlying host OS. There are also OS-based containers. Gives you a little bit more isolation, and they're a lot like VMs, but they don't have the hypervisor, and we'll cover a little bit about what those look like. So container engines, what are they? Because you hear a lot of terms thrown around. You hear Rocket, Kubernetes, Docker, Swarm. So what are all of these? So Linux-based containers, or LXC, was actually the original one that came out in about August of 2008. It differs from some of the other containers that we usually use in that it's an OS level container. So you're actually kind of virtualizing the OS. But what you are not doing is virtualizing the hardware, like the network cards, the different interfaces, and the hard drives on the host. Those are actually bare metal. Docker is what we usually think of when we think of containers. That is the application level container. That is what SQL Server is deployed in. It is the most commonly used container engine. Is like kind of the de facto standard. And then if you haven't heard, another kind of container engine out there is Rocket. It is an application container. It's by Container Linux Core OS. That came out in October 2013. Sorry, October 2008. Oh no, it is 2013. And then that one is kind of got some other features. And when we start looking at clustering, that was one of the first kind of container engines to bring out clustering. And I forgot to throw that out there, but Docker kind of came out in March of 2013. And I'm putting the dates out there so that when we talk about containers kind of being new, I want you to realize that they've kind of been around for a while. We're now in 2018. So these Docker images started kind of coming out in 2010. So they're a little bit more developed, I think, and have been in use a little bit longer than we tend to think of. So those are the different kind of container engines that we have. And if you look again, what we talked about, this is Docker's definition of a container. A container is an environment that contains all your binaries and libraries for a single piece of software to run, no matter the environment. So you could actually move them around. If you think about vMotioning, you could do the same thing once you have that Docker kind of orchestration piece. It'll move your Docker around and take care of some of those pieces around for you so that you can kind of fail over. And this is kind of a good overview if you look at an application-based container versus a virtualized environment, some of the benefits that you get. So if we look up here on the upper left, and I don't know if you can see my mouse moving around, both of these kind of have our different application layers. Each set has its bin and libraries, but what you have on the virtualized layer that you don't have over here on your Docker layer is you have a guest OS and you have a hypervisor. So when you remove these two things, that can speed up the performance of these containers and you can get a lot more consolidation. If you look at a typical virtual environment, when I've talked to people who are starting to deploy containers, if they could maybe get, let's say, 5 DBAs on a single ESX host with their SQL servers kind of deployed in that environment for test dev, they could get 25 in a host OS or a single kind of physical host in a Docker environment. So there's a lot less fluff in there without having to maintain the guest OS and the host, or the hypervisor. And if you look at performance issues, if you've ever virtualized SQL Server, I talk about this one a lot. You'll often talk to people and they say that they're having performance issues. Usually those tend to be storage layers because that has been virtualized. They will go talk to their admins. The SQL Server DBAs will be seeing performance issues, and the admins are not seeing anything when they start looking at all their metrics on the host OS When they start monitoring the storage and the CPU, everything kind of seems to be fine to them. And a lot of times where that is bottlenecking is in the hypervisor. So the other kind of cool things about containers is that it does run on the bare metal, and you do have a little bit more segmentation because you're not sharing the resources from the hypervisor layer. They are actually directly kind of allocated to each container. So you don't have that kind of finger pointing of trying to wonder where those bottlenecks are. So think of it like SQL Server, where you could provision each instance. If you had a multi-instances running, you could provision certain CPUs or a certain amount of memory to each SQL Server instance so they don't step on each other. So I'm going to think that is all of that for that slide. So I wanted to know if anybody had any questions so far.
Not so far. We're good to go. Sorry, I was.
Okay. On mute. Yep. So let me go over. Hopefully everything is going to work all right in my demo, because I was telling Ree that I was having some issues. It's been a little funky this morning. So I've been able to kind of like bring some of this up, and sometimes it works and sometimes it does not. So we're going to try this real quick. And I think it is that I have probably too much running on my box. That is probably the issue. So I'm going to go type this in. So if you've ever kind of looked at, and let me go back over here, the demo of the Linux-based containers, this is a really kind of good place to get started. These are some of the commands that you're running. And if you run through this, this will show you how to run a container really quickly on your laptop. If you got a Linux-based laptop, or on a VM, if you've got one, you can kind of install this and get this up and running. So the first thing that you have to do is kind of pull your container image from a repository, very similar to pulling something down from PowerShell if you want to like install the SQL Server utility. So I am going to go ahead and pull the latest down from Microsoft. I think I just did this earlier and I probably shouldn't have. So you can see what it looks like to pull the image. Very exciting stuff, right? Watching somebody type in. All right. I was trying to paste earlier and that was not working very well. So here we go. And you can see we've already pulled, usually you'll see like 6 or 7, I should record this, different little streams while it's pulling down. It only takes about a minute or two to kind of pull down the container image. And then once you do that, to get up and running with a container image, and this is where I was having some issues earlier, so I think I've got that worked out. I'm going to show you how quickly you can get, if you've ever installed a container. How quickly it is.
So just really quickly, Marsha, this font's pretty small. If anybody's having trouble seeing it, you always have the option to zoom in GoToMeeting.
Let me see if I can pull this up. And this is where I have no idea why this is not working. So it was working earlier. I've got it in multiple times. Let me check my code one more time. So we've got sudo docker run -e. I accept the EULA. I've got my password in there.
So Marsha, I do have the question, what is that password being used for?
Oh, this is the SA password. So what we've got in here right here. So I'll walk through this. So sudo is basically like telling Linux, if you've ever used sudo, that you're going to run as SA. So whenever you type in the sudo, and when you saw me pull the bash command when I was pulling down the latest repo, it asked me for my password, so I don't have to enter my password every time. So sudo means I'm going to run as SA. Docker run means I'm going to run a certain command in Docker. And then -e, I'm going to accept my EULA. These are parameters I'm passing in. -e, I'm going to accept my password. This may be where I have actually my issue. I'm missing a slash. /p, I've got the port number that SQL Server is going to run on. I have, double check, -p. Then I have -- name for SQL 31 is my instance, \-d. And this is the repo that I downloaded earlier that I'm going to be using. And I have some kind of syntax error in here. I had pasted it earlier and I don't know.
Look at -p before. Should there be a space right there, or is it -p with the ports?
Oh, thank you, Ray.
No, thank Melanie.
See, I don't know what I've done. And I had this pasted and I was using it -name -d ncr.microsoft.com, and I had it running earlier and I don't know what I did. Like, I was just using the up arrows to go back and forth and it locked up. So sudo docker run -e except EULA space -e sa password secret. Thought that would be kind of cool because that should be something you never do. \-p my port numbers --name SQL 31 -d. This should work. I'm looking at it. It all looks good. And I had that issue. I'm going to try this earlier. I pulled out the sudo because I was already logged in as sudo to see if it ran, and it ran fine. And if this doesn't work, we're going to go back to my other window, because this should actually, in about 2 seconds, get you a SQL Server on Linux kind of installed and up and running. And then once you've kind of done that, let me clear my screen, and you get that up and running, we're just going to move on. Some of the other things that you can do are then look at, I'm pulling up my notes. Oh, that screen's moving around. Once you do that, if you want to see all the different environments that you have up and running, you can see earlier, actually, which is why I have no idea why this is not working. I know I have to change my port number. When I was testing for the demo, I got all these different SQL servers installed just fine, up and running. So then if you want to then play around with this a little bit more, I'm going to move, having mouse issues. You can see that I've got about 7 different environments up and running. Wow, that's nice. Every time I flip over, everything moves. All right, so we're going to go back here. So I did that, and then if I wanted to stop one of my instances, I can go docker stop, name my instance, SQL Server stopped. And if you've ever tried to power up a VM, you know that it takes a lot more to kind of power up a VM. It takes a lot longer. Works a lot better if you can type. And that is as quickly as it takes to kind of get these up and started, up and running. We're going to try a couple more things. So usually when I set up my demos, I will get all of these up and running, and then I start going around and removing them. So if I want to uninstall one of these little Docker containers, my mouse back, you first have to stop the Linux container, and then you kind of do the same thing. You need to go sudo, logging in as sa, docker, rm, SQL1. And then when I come back here, and I want to see what is up and running, if I come back to my list of Linux-based containers, Don't you love this? Sudo ps-a, what we did earlier. There you go. You can see that SQL 1 is no longer installed. And this is my list now. I've got 5. Every time you run these commands, as you can see when we were looking at the command earlier to run this, even though it's not running, the things that you would have to change out every time, you can keep the same SA password if you want. You do need to have a unique port, and you do have to have a unique instance name. If you try to install right over the top of that, that will throw you an issue. And I'm going to go try this one more time. I'm going to try to do this how I normally do it with SQL 1 and see if that gives me a little bit, now that I've removed one of my instances, better install. I'm going to go ahead and put the sudo back in here. All right, not working today, not being my friend. This is what the joy of live demos is. So I will get back to that and figure out a way to automate this in a better way so I don't get all these started and then they don't run. So let's go back to this real quick. So those are the commands usually. Come up here to get started, and then we'll go back to container orchestration. So as you can see, I had some issues with my demo. Container orchestration kind of like smooths some of those out, have the typing issues. So other terms that you often hear when you're looking at containers are Docker Swarm, Kubernetes. If you're using Azure, you're actually using and have containers up in there, you're actually using the Microsoft Azure Service Fabric, Red Hat OpenShift, and Windows. All of these are container orchestrations, just like you use virtualized orchestrator, some other tools from Cisco. You can realize that these will actually kind of simplify and make automating and deploying your environments really, really quick. So I'm going to give you some terminology overviews when you're looking at the container orchestration. When you first start playing around, you're going to probably do it like I did, download a Linux-based container and play around with it. If you're going to use it in a corporate environment, you're more than likely going to use one of these type of orchestration tools. So when you're using an orchestration tool, some of the terminology that you need to be familiar with, it's a container host. This would be very similar to if you're looking in a virtualized world with VMware, an ESX host. That is where all your containers are going to run. This can be either Windows or Linux. Usually it's kind of a Linux-based host from 99% of the container orchestrators that you're going to be running. Container engine is what you're going to be using to interact and to deploy and run. In the case of SQL Server, that container engine is going to be Docker. And then you're going to be using one of these container orchestration tools on top of it that we showed earlier, which could be one of these. More than likely, if you're in the cloud, you're using this one, the Microsoft Azure Service Fabric. I like Windows a lot if you're going to be doing Windows-based containers. I worked with a lot of customers on that. Red Hat OpenShift is also a really good one, and then Kubernetes is probably the other one that most people commonly use. Red Hat OpenShift has a lot of automation within. Kubernetes tends to be a little bit more cloud-based orchestration. Red Hat OpenShift has a lot of things if you want to do some kind of on-prem cloud solution. So that's one of the reasons why I like it. So then you're going to have a container repository, which is basically a list of all the images or containers that you have deployed, and then container images. So those will be all the SQL Server instances that you have kind of deployed. And so I'm going to give you a quick demo of what the Windows orchestration tool looks like. As you can see up here, we're kind of connected. Here are all the different images that we have in our kind of image repository. Pretty easy, as you can see, it's got a nice interface to like play around with. And then down out here, we've got the different environments that we've stood up. And then down here, we have creating a new image. I'm going to walk you through what this looks like. Give it a few seconds to kind of get up and running. because I was smart enough to record this one. So we'll have that going just a second. The other thing I like about these, like, so if you look at like some of the issues that you have, like getting the container up, one of the issues you have is what am I going to do now to get the data in the container? These container orchestrations kind of interface with different databases, different storage, whether you have it on disk, it might be using some of the Microsoft tools to actually clone out a database so that you're just kind of using the SQL Server cloning, or it can act with different SANs to make copies of that data or directly attach you to an existing volume. So let's get this going. So right now we're going to go look down at the binaries where all this stuff is contained for the containers, and all these different little things that you're seeing are each SQL Server environment. So you can see that each little SQL Server environment has its own bin and library set. Those are all unique. One thing I do like about containers, if you ever heard that you can't do reporting services, or maybe there may be some issues with agent, this kind of does a Windows-based deployment. It's like added some extra features so that you can actually really quickly and easily get up and running. So right now what they're doing is they're editing one of the Docker files that was created for the deployment of a SQL Server. Right there is the source. Right there, I work for Pure, so this one right here is connecting to a Pure storage SAN to actually grab a volume. This works with lots of other storage vendors. They've integrated with quite a few. So that is the source volume that I originally had where my production data is set. And this is the IP address where they're connecting up. In just a second, you can see this with a point and click, this file was created. He actually didn't have to go in, and you didn't have to change anything out when you were, what am I saying? You didn't have to go manually type in all the commands to get this. This is actually just showing the Docker file that is created that is going to run when you use the point and click for deploying one of these kind of containerized applications. And you will see that in just a second, we're actually going to run this. So right here, we are actually encrypting the password that is connecting to our storage real quick. We'll step through that. So the little utility they have that generates encrypted passwords so that your storage admins, no matter what you're using, won't get mad at you, and they can pass this along. So he's copying that and actually editing that file right there to put in the.
So Marsha, if you happen to have an extra Pure array around, I would love somewhere to practice building containers.
You should be able to do it on yours right now. So, and it works. This works not just on a Pure storage array. They have this running on several different arrays.
Our arrays are production arrays. I think my company would frown upon me and going out there and throwing up some containers.
Well, you could actually, so that is the cool thing. I will talk to you. So there are container orchestration tools. So we have one, we work with Red Hat OpenShift, and we have the Pure Service Storage Orchestrator under there. Other people have orchestration tools. So what we actually do when you're presenting all that on a storage layer, I think everybody thinks that their storage admin would freak out if they started spinning up these containers. So with the orchestration tool that they set up, what they actually give when they talk to this container engine is a space where you can safely play, that you only have access. It's like creating a volume that you only have access to this amount of space, and they can give you 5 terabytes, and it doesn't let you cross into that production environment. So it kind of segments off a portion of your array so that it's really safe. So that might make it a little bit easier. And several people have kind of tools like that to limit the amount of space, because the fear is, if you look at when you're spinning up, you know, everybody wanted VMs, everybody wanted a copy of the production environment. Great thing about containers is that you can easily spin them up. The problem is getting the data into them. So a lot of times people are using the SQL Server cloning, or they're taking a volume and then directly attaching it and mounting it into that container to get their database. Because you kind of want that data portability, right? You don't want, if your container goes away, all that data to go away if it's a production environment, or maybe you're trying to copy out your production environment and quickly give it to your developers. So that's where kind of any kind of storage-based solution will help out with the cloning. If you're not going to be using that, then you're going to probably want to look at something like Microsoft SQL Server cloning and presenting that over to the other. Does that make sense, Ree?
It did, but they're still not going to let me do it.
Well, I would say, as people like play around with it, there'll be more. So the point I was trying to make with the orchestration tools where they segment it off, if you had a 5 terabyte database, all of your developers have wanted that copy of that 5 terabyte database. So the fear is that when we give these tools to developers where they can quickly, and I just watched this run, spin this back a little bit because I just kept talking. I should have stopped that. Is that when you give developers the ability to spin up and down their containers, that they're going to go hog wild, and the next thing you know, you're going to have 100 containers with 5 terabyte databases in there, and they just killed your entire SAN. And so that's where these orchestration tools, where they segment off a portion that only let you grow so large, that's really helpful. A lot of the more modern SANs have these cloning technologies, where the other cool thing is that you can make copies of your databases, and it doesn't actually consume extra space. So you could have 25 copies of those. So I think storage utilities that the modern storage providers are providing, combined with containers, kind of give you that environment that we've all been trying to go to. So I'm going to go back and get back to the beginning.
My DevOps DBA is on this webinar right now, and no, he can't have any pure array containers either before he asks.
Well, then, but here's the other thing. So when you're looking at those, you can also, if you wanted to, segment off them into a smaller array, if you wanted to give them their own space, right? And replicate that one production database down to that space, and then start making clones of it in there, and that does not impact your production environment. So maybe you have a really large, 50 terabyte array in your production environment. You might need a much, much smaller array in your dev environment, which is usually the exact opposite. Usually dev environments tend to be a lot larger, but with some of the modern cloning techniques, you can get them a smaller, less expensive array. Does that make sense? Would that make your DevOps guy happy?
They're never happy. That's not true. He's a great guy.
So what I like here, and I think I got back. Here's an example of, we have got a database audit that we've kind of like brought down into this environment, and we actually want to kind of clone this out. So we are sitting there giving this instance a name, a port number, right? We each have to have a unique port number. We're typing in the password. And so the cool thing is, not only is this spinning up our container, but it is actually putting the data into the container for you. And so let's finish watching this kind of play out. Another awesome, very secure password. And if you also look at how containers are changing, new features are being added all the time. Every time before I give one of these talks, I go Google, what are the new features that have been released in container? Because it's changing on an almost daily basis. It seems like, at least a weekly basis. I would think there's a new feature. So if we're going to scroll down, and we're going to see really quickly, we should see our new instance down here. It's right there. There's a new instance with the name Accelerate. And we're going to kind of open up in just a second. We should be able to look at that environment. Now we're starting that container. So you saw that it only took a few seconds to deploy. You could get a virtual environment usually deployed pretty quickly, but usually you're installing. And even if we had automated most things, if I were looking at deploying a VM, it usually, once I got a hold of it to deploy my database on it, I could get it done in half an hour, but it usually may take me 4 or 5 hours to get that spun out from my virtualization container layer. To automate all the install of SQL, the expanding of drives, getting the network cards up. That was always something very difficult to do. So you can look in here and see that we actually took that physical audit database and we kind of cloned it over here into a container. We actually cloned all the databases in that environment over into this very lightweight container. You can also see we got the SQL Server agent up in there and running, because this is a Windows-based container that's been virtualized using Docker on top of a Linux host. So I think that's pretty neat. So that is the end of that container orchestration demo. So container orchestration tools are very nice because they don't have the same issues like you saw me fingering all over my demo earlier. So one of the reasons why I'm a fan. Things I'm working on next, I'm going to actually get the Red Hat OpenShift container orchestration spun up in my environment. So this is kind of some of what we were talking about while we were looking at that. Why you need to have kind of a storage strategy, I think, when you're working with your containers, just because it could take still a long time. I've talked to people who are spinning up containers and then they're taking their databases and backing them up, or taking a backup, copying it over into a container and restoring it. I don't think that's why we want a container. We want to be able to spin it up very quickly, especially if you're doing DevOps. I always talk about rollback. You're either going to, I always like to present a new, for every kind of code push that I'm doing, a new presentation of that database that is a copy of my production data so that I can actually test the rollback methods. Because I've seen a lot of issues with people like testing code, didn't quite deploy right, they roll back, the rollback script wasn't clean, and then they don't ever get good copies backing of the data, and they can't actually make sure the deployment works really well. So some of the use cases for containers are development, QA, ETL, and patching environments, right? We've kind of talked about why you'd want this in development and QA. I've talked to a couple of customers and people out there who are starting to use these for ETL environments. And why would ETL be a very good use case? If you look at ETL, a lot of times, you know, we want that data over into those environments. If they don't have to have the HA, they can kind of pick up back where they left off if something happens. But ETL environments are usually sitting there unused 99% of the time. Maybe you have one that's ETLing data throughout the day. Most people only usually let those kind of processes, because they are usually touching production data sets, happen off hours. So I think that's a really good kind of use case, that you are spinning something up for an ETL, you're deploying that out there, you're kicking off all those jobs, you're letting it run, and then you spin it back down at the end of the night when all those kind of processes are done, and you got all those resources back. And then the other thing I like, if you've ever tried to get your dev environments, why containers are great, patch, because they share a host OS. When you do those kind of like Windows or Linux-based patching, all of those security patches that are applied to the host propagate automatically to every single container environment. The other thing is that once you modify one of those container images and you pull down a new repo, every deployment gets all the updates. So you're not spending all that time in watching the Windows guys deploy the patches, sitting there watching every single server environment reboot, making sure it's coming up. You know, something we usually try to pass on to our junior DBAs, but DBAs seem to get involved a lot of times in patching environments. I've been in some places where we automate them and they call us if an environment didn't come back up, but a lot of times we're sitting there in the middle of the night watching all those environments to make sure they come back up. So I like this kind of use case for getting all the patching done really quickly using containers.
So before you move on really quickly, and one of these questions you might get to, but the other one I think pertained to the last slide. What happens when you need to restart a container host? Is the data persisted?
If you have presented that container into that environment, yes, it is persisted. Where it is not persisted is when you're spinning up and spinning them down. So that's what a lot of times people are doing, is they're taking that data, they're modifying it. Maybe that container crashes, they have some kind of issue and they need to redeploy it to a new environment and they don't have a good methodology. So let's see if I had, but if you are using like a plugin, that's what usually if you have a SAN with containers, I have a plugin that will present SAN-based storage. That does not go away. If you lose the container and you have not presented a plugin and you've actually just kind of like set the container and given it the space, you could lose the data. So that's where the plugins presenting it to the storage array are kind of really good. Does that make sense? Rather than kind of having direct attached storage directly on each container host.
I'm going to assume it made sense to the person that asked the question.
So think of a plug-in as just making a fiber channel or iSCSI connection where your SAN people have presented a volume to you. That plug-in can take a SQL Server database with all your MDS and LDS from the SAN and present it up into the container.
Okay.
It's just that type of connection. And so if you lose the container, all the data is still on your SAN. That's why I think that people need to be thinking kind of about storage strategies, especially as they start shifting to wanting to use these more into production type of environments. We need to kind of look at that kind of production strategy that we use to leverage to make sure that that data is safe and working, right? You don't want to sit there and deploy it as an application, a hypervised layer, not knowing, do you have RAID 5, that your data is protected? What happens if you lose a drive in that kind of container environment? What happens if the host OS goes down? That's also where these orchestration engines come in. So if you have the plugin working at the storage layer to persist your data, no matter where those containers, that container lives, you could have many container hosts, just like you do in a virtual environment. You can have multiple servers in your ESX farm. So the container orchestration tool can also move that container. We kind of deploy it, move it around onto the different hosts. And then if we look at some of the new features that are coming out too, right? We've now got replication, distributed transactions, but we also have AGs. So that is going to be something that you can do, right? You've got your AG, you've got your data sitting somewhere safe and secure, and now you're replicating that. Basically, that's what, fancy log shipping, fancy mirroring is what AGs are on Kubernetes. So you can now make sure that your data is persisted over into another environment without having to physically move that container and wait for it to start back up, which happens in a few seconds. You can seamlessly move over with the AGs that were released with 2019. That is only currently on Ubuntu, but Kubernetes, well, look at this. I put Kubernetes in my slide. And I should edit that. Is availability groups for containers has come out. So right now it's only on Ubuntu. It is coming out very soon for Kubernetes and Red Hat OpenShift. So expected soon. And then Red Hat Enterprise Linux is now supported with its own repo of container images that you can pull down from the Red Hat, what do they call it? Yum type of installer. So you can just pull those Linux-based container images directly from Red Hat. So any questions so far? I think that is pretty much.
Yeah.
Oh,
pop this. You finish what you're doing and then we'll cover the question.
Okay. So what are some of the issues with regular, sometimes Linux-based containers? SQL Server reporting services, SSIS and SSAS are not out yet with containers. I really wish they were, because I think a reporting service or an integration service or analysis service is a fabulous use case for those, right? Just like if you're looking at an ETL server, SSRS, SSIS, those are only kind of doing things during a certain time of day. Analysis server, only building your cubes, usually once a day and then persisting up. So they're only using resources for a limited time. And I don't think for most of the Linux-based container engines that the agent is out. I could be wrong on that. I just was trying to look and see if that was actually working. If you look at some of the things like Windocs, what they're doing, they've actually added some advanced capabilities where these services are available. Not that I'm saying that one's better than the other. I think these are soon to come out for the other hypervisors. But if you do want some of these features, I think right now they're only available in the Windocs distribution and coming out soon in the other distributions. So what were the containers that you the containers? It's on my mind. What were the questions that you had, Ree?
So somebody asked, what is licensing like?
That's a great question, and I don't know. I don't think I've actually looked at the licensing costs. I would assume that it's going to work pretty much just like regular licensing, that for virtualization, where usually you're going to license an entire host. That would usually require enterprise licensing. That would be my assumption. But if you look at the consolidation rates where you had maybe 5 VMs and now you're getting 25, I think that's pretty affordable, but or you're going to have to license the individual processors that each SQL Server instance is using.
So I think that probably makes the most sense, having to license at the host level, because you have the ability to spin up and spin down containers whenever you want, and everybody would just spin them down when it came time to true up. I mean, that's what people would do. So
I've never told anybody to like turn off their DR environment so that it's not visible for licensing costs. It's only coming up during DR. Never. Yeah. So it's what people do, right? They power off, they spin these environments.
It's what people do.
I mean, I had the same thing that happened like with when we were managing Oracle licensing. You know, they're famous for their licensing costs. And they were telling me that everything that my vCenter could see, which is every ESX host in the entire environment, I was going to have to license. That's how they changed the Oracle licensing. And I was like, rather than my three hosts at my farm, you're now telling me I have to license like 2,000 physical servers? And they're like, yes. I'm like, so what if I give my virtual environment, that vCenter, I deploy a separate one that's only visible for Oracle? They're like, only Oracle is going to be in that environment. They're like, that limits your coverage, and that's what you're now only have to cover the 3 hosts. So we'll always find those ways around the kind of licensing when people do things like that. So I would assume that it's going to be at the host layer, because yeah, a lot of these are going to be very much in flight. But I will put that down as a good. Can we post things back to these once they're published, Ree?
I don't understand.
Can I add comments to them? So you're going to put these out on YouTube.
You could add comments onto YouTube, but I could have an email go out to attendees in the coming days if there's any information you wanted to include there.
Okay, yeah. So I'll look up the licensing costs and figure out what that is, and I'll get a definite answer on that.
Okay.
What other questions do we have?
A lot of people were trying to help.
Help me with my Docker installer that didn't
help
work?
you with. So somebody did ask, what are the backslashes for? Although she actually typed backsplashes. I think she's been working on her kitchen, remodeling and stuff. So what are the backslashes used for?
I don't know. It's like typing basically kind of commands. And so I will pull this over so you can see it. Hold on. I'm going to see if I can get out of full screen mode.
And then somebody suggested you remove the backslashes to make it work.
So if I was in PowerShell, that would absolutely be the case. So here's the funny thing. We're gonna move these around so that you can see. We're gonna do a side by side. I literally copied and pasted this. I had it up and running. I have ran it like 100 times. So when you go over here, here it is. If you're in Bash and Linux, and I'm on a Mac, so I'm on Linux, right? So I'm not in Windows running this in PowerShell. These are the commands that you have to run. Sudo docker run -e accept, and I've tested this before and it works. Otherwise, I couldn't have created all those other environments. But I am open to typos. I'm not sure this is a typo issue. -e sa password, right? And then you're piping that over, passing that in as a parameter right here. So we got the -e. See if we can see this on top of each other. Yeah. -e accept EULA, -e sa password. That's in quotes. Oh, I have an extra slash in here when I was fixing it. Look at that. When I put them up on top of each other. Hold on. Get my mouse back. Completely lost my mouse. There it goes. I had one too many slashes. -p, port 1433, SQL 1, and then I'm telling it backslash to use that repository. Okay. I must have put an extra slash because I've had a notepad of all the comments. Oh, looky here. Thank you for asking the backslash question. Makes me so happy. Sudo docker run -e except EULA -e password -p. I've got my port numbers -name SQL 1 backslash -d. Anybody see another one? Because I would love to know.
Someone would like for you to remove all the backslashes.
We can try it. We'll try it.
But it worked earlier with backslashes.
Oh, it did work earlier. I could have swore because I have, look, I have.
No, I watched you. Guys.
Yeah. And right here is my little notepad. But yes, thank you. That worked. Removing all the backslashes. Thank you, whoever that is. So if I now look
Tony Green,
and I run.
Tony Green wins the internet today.
Does he automatically get the prize for making things awesome? So look how quickly that installed a brand new SQL Server instance. That was in just seconds. So maybe we should like say something like, why I'm not in PowerShell. The slashes. So anyway, if I sit there and I go back, now that I pass all those like failed commands, and well, we're just going to go back and do this. You can see if I sit there and do the I'm having a day today. I cannot type anything. Sudo docker ps-a. See it. You can see now all of a sudden we should have up in here the SQL Server environment that I just spun up 2 hours ago, about a minute ago. Right here is my new environment.
I love how that's all casual. About a minute ago.
Yeah, but like that is really, really quick. If you look at like how long it would take you in a virtual to actually install SQL Server to get it. But what it's doing, I would guess for these containers, and I haven't looked at it, just like when we talk about cloning volumes, they've got that repo with all the binaries up and done. So all they have to do is then kind of copy those over, reference into a new folder, which doesn't take a lot of time, right? So that makes it very, very quick to get a new environment up and running in about a second.
So another great question. Will this make upgrading SQL Server 2017 to 2019 easier?
I don't think so. Unless, well, I mean, what do they mean by that? That would be the question, because kind of the idea with the Dockers is, and specifically if you've got your storage persisted on your SAN, wherever that is, what you would do is maybe clone out. What I would do is clone out that volume so I have a copy of it, right? Kind of the same kind of thing that I would do if I was physically upgrading. Have a SQL Server 2017 container, clone out that volume to a new location, spin up a 2019 container, attach it and test the database. That would be kind of the easier portion of that, and convert it. Things don't work, roll back, but it's the kind of the same thing that you would do if you were in the physical or virtual world. It just takes you longer to spin that VM up. But what did they, was that what they meant? Or were they have this vision that you would just kind of attach to that data set? Because you still have to convert all the data.
I don't know. It was just a question.
Okay.
It was, I mean, I read it to you verbatim. It wasn't, I didn't get more detail.
Well, I was hoping that maybe they might like answer back if that was going to answering their question of what they're going for. Because once you do that conversion on that data set, that has always kind of been the problem. I guess when you testing these upgrades, you want to make sure everything works really, really well, is that you've got to make sure you have a good rollback plan. And unfortunately, I think there's a point of go or no go, that there's no going back once you've kind of done that conversion. What I usually do, because I do have that limited rollback, is I kind of do the conversion in stages. I go to the newer engine, and I've kind of done that same methodology. What you're talking about is where I was talking about earlier, where I had that separate, the old server. Now I'm going to my new server, and I go to the new engine, but I actually leave the database in compatibility mode. I just make sure that portion works. Then I do it at a separate time that we have scheduled with regression tests. I then will flip the compatibility mode and update my stats afterwards to make sure everything's working. The other thing I also do is I actually replay a trace of a production workload. This is what I tell anytime you're making any kind of physical hardware change in your environment or engine change. I think a really good way to test that is to take a trace of your production workload and replay that against your environment that you're upgrading, so that you can see what did it look like, how is it performing. You're monitoring your CPU and your IO and all that stuff, your memory usage, and then what does it look like when I make that migration.
Okay, so she says, by the way, she was thinking of attaching to, with regards to the upgrading question, she was thinking of attaching to an existing data set, but that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, so that's what I was thinking that she was doing. And also, you can't actually attach to that. You have to copy that data set. So with the way the SQL Server, the Windows functionality works, and the locking of files and how SQL Server works, you can't have two engines talking to the same data set, the same drives. That's why only one node of your SQL Server instance can only be up at a time. That split would be a problem if you had two different engines writing into the same database.
Okay.
And I will never forget the backslash again. Thank you, Tony. Hard lessons learned. That's why I always tell people, don't be afraid of failing. You know, that was a very public fail, but you know, when you do those things, you learn from them. You'll never do it again.
Hey, teamwork.
I know.
Everybody had options. So thank you all very, very much for participating today. I'm going to take the screen back from you.
Okay.
You guys can see all of my email and all that stuff in just a second. Well. And while I still have everybody's semi-attention, damn it, sorry. I did manage to, while Marsha was talking, reschedule this. Why does that keep happening? I'm going to stop. This session is November 28th. It is the Wednesday after Thanksgiving. So if you're interested in Azure Databricks, this is the session that Ginger Grant is doing at Summit. She will be doing it for the WIT group at the end of November. So we're good. I will fix this slide later. And Tony Green, who will forever be the Backslash guy, wins the $50 gift certificate from our sponsors Redgate and SQL Sentry, or Sentry One, today. So expect an email. If you don't get an email in the next few days, please follow up with me at WITVC. And I'll make sure it gets handled. And so everybody else, again, thanks for attending today. We really appreciate it. I will have this uploaded to YouTube by the end of the day. And if I can get that licensing information into an email in time before it auto sends, we'll have that done as well. So everybody have a fantastic